Hi everyone! In this lecture, we will look at the process of evolution, which is the source of biodiversity. We're going to discuss genetic variation, mechanisms of evolution, and speciation. Evolution is defined as a change in the genetic composition of a population over time. Evolution can occur at multiple levels. Microevolution occurs at the population level. An example of microevolution is antibiotic resistance. Antibiotic resistance occurs when a population of bacteria exists, and because we have genetic variation, some of those individuals within that population will have resistance to antibiotics. When antibiotics are applied to the population, all the bacteria that are quote-unquote normal or don't have resistance will die, leaving behind only the drug-resistant bacteria, which will then survive and reproduce and pass on whatever genes have allowed them to become resistant to this antibiotic. On the other hand, macroevolution is evolution that gives rise to a new species. Okay, let's cover a few definitions. First, genes are physical locations in chromosomes within each cell of an organism. Each gene has a specific segment of DNA that codes for a particular trait, such as body size, hair color, etc. The DNA itself can take several different forms, which are called alleles. So alleles are different forms of a gene. Genes are specific locations on a chromosome. All of the genes that are possessed by an individual makes up their genotype, and the physical expression of an individual's traits is called their phenotype. The phenotype is a product of an individual's genotype and environmental factors. So even if you have specific genes, your environmental factors will still play a role in what traits you express. For example, an individual might possess a gene that codes for growing into a tall adult, but if their environment has limited food and they don't get the resources or nutrients that they need during childhood, they may actually end up shorter than expected. Within a population, individuals will have different genotypes because they'll have different alleles. Genetic variation is really important because it can allow a population to be more resilient when faced with some disturbance. Genetic variation is caused by mutations. These can occur due to mistakes when DNA is copied. So during DNA replication, sometimes the enzymes involved do make mistakes, and those can become mutations if they aren't corrected. And also environmental factors like UV radiation can also cause mutations to occur to DNA. Mutations that occur in gametes, which are egg and sperm cells, can be passed on to the next generation. Most of the time, mutations are detrimental or harmful, meaning they do not help that organism to survive and reproduce. But sometimes, and this is in very small percentages, mutations will actually improve an organism's survival or ability to reproduce. So when those mutations are beneficial, that organism is more likely to pass those mutations on because that mutation allowed it to be more successful, and eventually that mutation will become an adaptation within a population. Evolution can occur in three ways: artificial selection, natural selection, and random processes. First, let's look at artificial selection. This is the process in which humans determine which individuals to breed, typically because they have some preconceived set of traits in mind. So they're looking for something specific when they're choosing which organisms to breed together. For example, humans have bred dogs for centuries, which explains the extreme variations that we see within the species. I'll use my two dogs as an example. Bear is an Akita. Akitas were bred for thick fur, large size, and having a protective personality because people wanted to use them for hunting and guarding in snowy regions. English Springer Spaniels like Pixie were originally bred as high-performance gun dogs, known for their ability to spring up to flush game birds out of the brush into the open so that hunters could kill them. Another example of artificial selection is with a plant called wild mustard. It's been bred to produce a variety of food crops that we all probably eat these days. So the original wild mustard ancestor, certain traits were chosen to end up with things as diverse as Brussels sprouts to broccoli to kale, all coming from that original ancestor wild mustard. When humans aren't directly influencing the breeding of individuals, evolution will occur by natural selection. This is the process in which the environment actually determines which individuals survive and reproduce. Fitness is the word that we use to describe an individual's ability to survive and reproduce, and that's where that phrase survival of the fittest comes from. Natural selection will favor any combination of traits that increases an individual's fitness, so increases its ability to survive and reproduce. The upper image you see on this slide shows a population of mice that has two color variants, one that's lighter and one that's darker. The setting of this population is in an environment that has a darker surface. These are actually called rock pocket mice, and their environment was shifted from kind of a sandy area to much darker after a volcanic eruption. So what we see in this population is that over time, the selective pressure of predation by hawks has caused mice with a darker fur color to be more likely to survive and reproduce because they're better camouflaged into their environment. That means they have higher fitness than the lighter colored mice. They're more likely to survive and reproduce because they've avoided that selective pressure of predation. Traits that increase fitness are called adaptations. So, like our cactus in the bottom, cacti are adapted for a dry desert environment because they have traits like a waxy outer layer and a low surface area to volume ratio, which both will reduce evaporation, so reducing water loss. The theory of evolution by natural selection was coined by a scientist named Charles Darwin, and it has a few key ideas. Individuals produce more offspring than can actually survive, and all of these individuals have different genotypes. The differences in their traits, so the differences in phenotype because of that genetic variation, can be passed on to future generations and can make some individuals more likely to survive and reproduce in the future. Evolution also occurs due to random processes that are not related to fitness. There's 5 random processes that we're going to look at that influence the genetic makeup of populations. These are mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, bottleneck effects, and founder effects. Mutations we've looked at already, but mutations that are not lethal add to the genetic variation of a population. And genetic variation is good because if there's a disturbance, it's more than likely that some individuals will survive because of differences in fitness. Gene flow is the second random process we're going to look at. This is the process by which individuals move from one population to another and alter those populations' genetic makeup. Basically, the mutations that accumulate in one population are then added into the other population because individuals of those populations will mate. We've looked at these Florida panthers before, but in 1995, the Florida panther population declined to only 30 individuals because of hunting and because of habitat loss. So when the population like that is so small, there's no gene flow between other populations because they're all kind of quarantined in one area. So this means that any harmful mutations like crooked tails, which you see in this photo on the bottom, will accumulate within that population. In order to increase genetic variation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service introduced 8 panthers from Texas to this small population in Florida. What that did is helped to breed out harmful mutations like crooked tails and other mutations related to disease resistance. And now what we see is that Florida panther population has increased to around 230 adults. Genetic drift is a change in the genetic composition of a population over time as a result of random mating. So naturally, depending on which individuals interbreed, allele frequencies within a population will change. Then we have bottleneck effects, which are drastic reductions in the size of a population that reduces genetic variation. So anytime you lose a big portion of a population, that's going to reduce the amount of genetic variation that exists. Bottleneck effects are caused by habitat loss, natural disasters, overhunting, and environmental changes. If a large chunk of a population dies off randomly because of some disaster, the remaining population will likely have different allele frequencies than the original population and will likely have less variation. Finally, the founder effect is a change in the genetic composition of a population as a result of descending from a smaller number of colonizing individuals. Basically, we see a new population being formed by a small number of individuals from a larger population. So in this image on the bottom right, you can see that a few founders, quote unquote, which are a few individuals from one big population that have moved to a smaller area, they carry with them different frequencies of alleles than the original population. So we can see that our mainland population, we have majority red individuals, but in our island population, we actually have a majority of individuals being gray. So these are our majorities for these two different populations. All right, so we finally made it through microevolution. Now we're going to look at macroevolution, which is also called speciation. And this is the formation of new genetically distinct species. There's two types of speciation that you need to know. The first one is allopatric speciation, and this is speciation that occurs due to geographic isolation. So what that means is an original species or an original population is divided into two groups by a geographic barrier. So that could be a mountain, that can be a rock slide, a river, a canyon, anything that splits that original population into two or into subgroups. Each group in itself will undergo natural selection, and eventually, over thousands, millions of years, those two populations will become so different that they can no longer reproduce to create fertile offspring. So that means those two groups have become two different species. The second type of speciation is called sympatric speciation, and this is the evolution of one species into two species without any geographic isolation. This is a little bit more complex than allopatric speciation. One example of sympatric speciation is it often occurs in plants when there's errors during cell division that make the eggs and sperm of certain individuals unable to combine effectively with plants that do not have that error. So you don't really need to know details about sympatric speciation. You just need to know that it's a type of speciation that occurs for the AP exam. All right, last slide. Evolution can occur slowly or relatively rapidly depending on the circumstances. Evolution by natural selection can occur over thousands to millions of years depending on several factors. The first is whether environmental changes are gradual or sudden. Gradual changes can lead to slower evolution, whereas sudden environmental changes will lead to more rapid evolution or extinction if that species actually can't adapt quickly enough. The amount of genetic variation within a population will also affect how quickly it can evolve. If there's more genetic variation, it allows for a population to respond quicker to environmental changes. Then finally, the lifespan of organisms within the population has an impact on the speed or pace of evolution, because the more generations that pass, the more potential for mutations to be passed on. So if you have a longer living organism like humans or elephants, we have slower evolution. Again, just to reiterate, if a species cannot adapt quickly enough, if there's not enough genetic variation, if there's too rapid of environmental changes, that species will go extinct. Then, last thing to cover is that evolution by artificial selection can occur in just a few decades, and that's because humans are involved selecting for very particular traits and choosing specifically which individuals to interbreed in order to get those traits within the population. This is your practice FRQ for 2.6. It's a good opportunity to look at data and practice making some claims.